Hello and welcome to this Facebook Live here at RN. I'm Joe Gelanisi from the Philosopher's Zone on RN. Good to have you along. And today we're with A.C. Grayling, philosopher, author of 30 to 40 books, I've lost count, on everything from Wittgenstein to war, from friendship to God. And now this man has turned his blistering intellectual prowess onto the problems with democracy. Anthony, welcome to this event.
Pleasure.
Great to be sitting next to you. Saw you on Q&A last night. I hope you enjoyed that.
I had fun on that, yes.
would have been great. Yeah. So look, why have you turned your attention now to democracy?
Well, of course, one thinks about it often, and in an earlier book in which I talked about the development of conceptions of civil liberties and the democratic political order, I've given some attention to it. But the events of 2016, of last year, the Brexit vote in the UK and the Trump election really did concern me, upset me indeed. And I thought, look, what's happened is we have a democratic order which is pretty imperfect, and we've been, not very happy about aspects of it for quite some time. But we've kind of gone along with it because, as Churchill said, it is the least bad of a lot of bad systems. But very recently, the advent of these extremely powerful new technologies of communication and analysis of information, these algorithms, these software techniques that you can use to profile people and to get messaging out there to people, has made a big difference. And I think what happened in 2016 is proof positive that we've passed the tipping point. So we now have to sit up and take notice.
I mean, there's a lot in there, and there's a lot to be said about the new technologies. But one thing that can be said is that information now can be given to people in greater ways than it used to be, that in fact it should work for democracy, that people would be better informed, that they can swap their views in quicker time and with perhaps more interchange, that it shouldn't be an issue for us. But you're laying it at the feet of technology to some degree.
Yes, indeed. Well, the thing is, you're dead right. I mean, this should be a great universal worldwide agora, and we can all discuss and put our points of view. Unfortunately, it is being swamped by a great deal of misinformation, what's called post-truth, post-fact. A lot of people who, because they've got cleverness at manipulating the system, are able to get things out there which are distorting, which are misleading. Hacking, for example, in social media, making it look as though people are thinking one way when really the truth lies in another direction. So we get the bad with the good, and I'm afraid the bad at the moment is on top. Fortunately, we've spotted it, and maybe there's something we can do about it.
So what's your difficulty with Brexit? I mean, the people voted?
No, well, firstly, I have to say I'm a very passionate Remainer, because I'm a great believer in the EU. I think the EU, imperfect though it is as well, is nevertheless a real model for how the world should be. It should be more cooperative, there should be more unity, there should be shared endeavour to try to move towards progress and prosperity and the dissemination of views about human rights and the like. So I'm a big believer in the EU. And the thing about the Brexit referendum was that it was extremely badly constructed. So firstly, there was no supermajority requirement built in. It was meant to be entirely advisory, consultative only, not binding on government or parliament. The people who campaigned to leave had no plan, no roadmap, no policies, no suggestions about what would happen, just a lot of distortions and lies. And in the end, what happened was this. The electorate enfranchised for the referendum was a deliberately restricted one. Now, we know that. That's out in the public domain. David Cameron, who was Prime Minister at the time, has confessed that he just didn't want to have an argument with the right wing of his party about 16 and 17-year-olds and expats and so on. So it was a deliberately...
But there's an argument there about that age, isn't there?
Well, that is a separate issue. But when you consider the groups most materially affected by the outcome of such a referendum, would certainly have included 16 and 17-year-olds, and it certainly would have included EU citizens from other EU countries, paying their taxes in the UK, because they should have had a say in the outcome. And in the event of that restricted electorate, only 37% of that electorate voted to leave. And yet it was treated, because of the way the vote translated on the actual number of votes cast. It was treated as a mandate by the government when, of course, it's nowhere near one.
Well, it's interesting you should say that. I was just looking at the wires this morning in the papers, and in fact, this debate is still there in the UK, obviously, as the Parliament is attempting to do something with this exit. And the Brexit Secretary David Davis warned the UK that the British people did not vote for confusion, and neither should the Parliament. So that 37% for Davis is, in fact, that's what the majority has ruled.
Well, I mean, 37% is not a majority of anything. You would expect David Davis to say that. He would say that, wouldn't he? Obviously, he's singing from a particular hymn sheet. And this story is a long way from being over, a long way from being over. There's a very powerful, very determined, very upset Remain campaign or set of campaigns doing different things in the UK. So it's not beyond the possibility that Brexit won't happen. And the most likely thing that will happen if Brexit isn't stopped is there will be what is very misleadingly called a soft Brexit, which means, in fact, staying in under a slightly different name, slightly different arrangements, which in a few years' time will revert to be full membership. That's why, if you look at the other side of the story at the moment, so many Brexiters are so cross. I mean, they're very cross with the way things are going, because it's not just that the government is mishandling the so-called negotiations so badly, and they really are. I mean, it is a well dog's breakfast, but also because they can see the writing on the wall. The thing about our relationship, the UK's relationship with the rest of Europe, is that over the last 4 decades and more, we've integrated with our European partners so intimately and closely that we're like Siamese twins joined at the brain. So to try and separate those brains and keep both parties alive, that's difficult.
You've mentioned a few things there: supermajority and the franchise itself, which you just spoke about. But when one thinks of democracy, one doesn't think of this term of a supermajority. You go and vote, and you would hope that the greatest numbers add up, and that's what gets in. Tell me what a supermajority is and why that's important in something like the discussions around Brexit and the democratic failure as you see it.
Yeah. Well, this is an enormous constitutional change. Now, think about the fact that we have a Parliament Act in the UK where if a government wants to dissolve Parliament and have an election out of the fixed term, which should be 5 years of a Parliament, they have to get a supermajority of the members of the House of Commons to permit them to do it. And that supermajority is 66%. They have to get 66% of all the seats in Parliament to get a dissolution of Parliament for an election. Why? Because an election could bring about a significant change in policy and in the way the country is run. Well, the change that would result if we were to leave the EU is vastly greater than the change that might be brought about by a general election. And yet they put in no requirement for a minimum level of vote for such a constitutional change. I'll give you an example. About 20 years ago, there was a devolution debate relating to Scotland. And that referendum required that a minimum of 40% of the total electorate should vote for that change, otherwise it wouldn't happen. In the event, although there was a majority for the change, the proportion of the electorate involved was about 32 or 33%. Well, in the case of the Brexit referendum, 37% of the electorate voted to leave, and that is not by any traditional, any theoretical, any sensible view of a mandate for a big constitutional change. It's not anywhere near enough.
Okay, well, let's invite some comments from our Facebook Live audience today. Just want to point out, Amanda points out an interesting correlation between Brexit and Australia's same-sex marriage postal survey. I think you come across this. I think you may have discussed it last night on Q&A. She says the SSM plebiscite survey, it's actually a survey, it's a postal survey, will not show the desires of the future. We are outnumbered by older generations who may not represent the people the survey will most affect. This is kind of your point about
Indeed,
Brexit.
yeah, that's a very, very good point, actually, because, again, it's the people who are going to be most affected, who are being swamped, or the outcome of their decision are going to be affected, probably adversely, by older, more traditional people or people with a particular religious outlook. By the way, in connection with your postal survey, as they call it here, not plebiscite, really, really and truthfully, a representative democracy, and maybe we'll come back to talk more about the technicalities of that, it's our parliamentarians who should be stepping up and making this decision, not passing the buck, not saying, well, we're not going to be held to blame or anything, we're going to put this out there, but in an arrangement which is quite, it's quite possible that it could be claimed by the losing side to be indeterminate. And that would be very unhelpful.
Representative democracy. Just before I get to that, Julia has noticed that Scotland's gone a bit quiet since the election. Have you got any views on that?
Well, and there's a lot of anxiety, of course, in Scotland about the effect of Brexit on Scotland and the people and the economy there. Secondly, this bill, which is going through Parliament at the moment, which has just been passed by the House of Commons, it won't be passed by the House of Lords, by the way, but it's passed the House of Commons, would take powers away from Scotland and reduce the degree of devolution that's happened in the past. The third reason for it, of course, is that with tactical voting against the Conservative government, the SNP lost seats and has a slightly smaller representation in Westminster as a result. And there are some difficulties about education and the economy in Scotland that the SNP are dealing with at the moment. And their drive to go for an independent Scotland, if there is a Brexit, has had to be they've had to resile from it a little bit because the situation is very complex there. Although I, as somebody who tremendously supported the continuation of the union between England and Scotland when they had their referendum a couple of years ago, I now think that if Brexit were to happen, a hard Brexit, a proper Brexit, and as I say, I don't think it's likely, but if that were to happen, then I think Scotland should go independent.
Representative government and representative democracy, because this is what you're really talking about. It's the failure of a particular type of democracy. Tell me, what is the issue? What is the question that democracy is trying to answer, and how does representative democracy work in that regard? Because that feeds into this thing about failures of the system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, 2,500 years ago, Plato took a very, very elitist view of this matter, and he said, look, the ordinary people, they're not well enough informed, they don't think clearly enough, they're too prejudiced and short-termist and self-interested, and you can't put political power in their hands because the result would be bad government. So he gave democracy the idea that the people should have the right to a say, a voice in the government of their own lives. He gave that idea a very bad name. Now, I think if you think clearly and rationally about this matter, it's indefensible to argue that the people should not have a right, should not have a voice. So the big question is, how do you guard against the possibility, maybe, that it could go wrong in Plato's sense, while at the same time respecting the right that the people have? You could put the point like this. You could say, the people, the citizens of a country, have a right to be the final arbiters, the final repository of political power. But at the same time, they also have a right to good government. So how do you get the great diversity of interests and conflicts and disagreements in society? How do you get that into a good governmental system? Well, the system that was devised right from the middle of the 17th century onwards and through the American Revolution, Madison and Jefferson, John Stuart Mill writing about representative government in the middle of the 19th century, Benjamin Constant, and all these people gave a lot of thought. And they came up with the idea, here you've got the people and their will, and if you can devise some institutions and some practices that would take that and translate it into good government, and the way you do it is by making the democracy representative. So the people vote for representatives to go meet together in Parliament, get the facts, discuss, debate, listen to arguments, form a judgment, and then act on the basis of that judgment. And if we don't like what they do, we can kick them out and we can put other people in. That's the idea. Representatives are not delegates. They're not messengers. They're not there just saying what we want.
They don't just take your vote and say, that's it,
No.
the conduit without any kind of
No,
filtering.
exactly. We've voted for them. We've said to them, go and do this job on our behalf. Think on our behalf. Get the facts and come to some good decisions in our interests. Now, unfortunately, what's happened with our political system is that the representatives no longer always or only represent us. They represent their party interest, an agenda, and all sorts of other things that come into this picture. You mentioned money and lobby interests and big corporations and industries.
And in fact, quite a few people on Facebook have made that point.
Yeah.
Michael says, can it be that a democratic way of policing is... this is about reason, actually. Can a democratic way of policing be just too intellectual, too rational, offering tittle to identify with and to be proud of? Sorry, that wasn't about corporate interest, because a lot of people have written about that. But that's an interesting point too, because in a sense, what you're talking about is a kind of bloodless, rational process of filtering through the common will, as it were, and trying to get some kind of, filtered through answer to this, or a question that can be debated at Parliament. But it sort of leaves behind the emotional links that people have, the cultural links. Religion, for instance, I know that's been a big issue for you. The sorts of roots that grow deep. And I wonder whether some of the things that you're talking about, such as the Trump ascendancy, is about that. It's about too much of a kind of bloodless way of trying to do politics, a managerial way of trying to do politics. And the real stuff of being human has been left behind in some ways.
Well, firstly, it's odd, but people do go and say it was either black or white. If you have too much of that, then you don't get enough of this, and so on. The fact of the matter is that when people are designing the aeroplane that you're going to fly in, you want them to be rational. Okay, you don't want them to be feeling their way around how to organise that aeroplane. There are plenty of places where rationality and careful thought and logic and getting the facts and being very scientific really matters. And quite often in public policy decisions, you want that kind of rationality. You want care, you want thought, you want information, you want people to work things out. Now, I agree with you and agree with Michael there that it is also important that the human aspect, the sense of justice, of real justice, not just utilitarian justice, and warmth, and the idea that human diversity and differences of interests and needs and desires in society should be respected and taken into account. And so public policy which relates to those matters, the provision of welfare services, the provision of health services and mental health services, for example, how we organise our education so that our education is about the whole person and not just about making them ready to go off and work in a supermarket or a factory. Those aspects we should certainly take into account. So we should recognise that a society, an advanced, mature society like the Australian society or the European societies, should make plenty of room and give plenty of oxygen to civil society organisations, NGOs and independent activity to respond to and to feed those aspects of us that you mentioned, the deep, the emotional, the things that matter to us even more than designing aeroplanes or running a government properly.
One of the words or one of the themes that comes up in these sorts of discussions is this idea of the common good. But in recent years, there's a fear that the centre, the broad centre that splits a little left, a little right, has actually collapsed. And the notion that me and you might decide what a common good is actually further away than ever before. And this is one of the reasons why the democratic process is on shaky ground. Do you give that any credence, this idea of... And I mean, we could feed into this the whole thing, as you say, technology, social media, tribes breaking out, identity politics, neoliberal policies. I mean, all bridging to a kind of individualistic, atomistic kind of life, or perhaps small clans that don't care too much about other clans.
Yeah. I think that there is a place for the concept of the common good where a lot of cross-referencing among different groups in society operate. I mean, for example, it is in everybody's interests that there should be a sufficient degree of security in the society, that there should be a provision of very basic services in the society, that if you have an accident, there's an emergency room not too far away, that there is a police force which protects us against the excesses of crime. Yes, so there is something which is the common good. But it is also part of the common good to recognise diversity. Not everybody has the same interests. Not everybody wants to toe somebody else's line. And so to be a tolerant society and one where individuals are able to create something flourishing for themselves without being too much interfered with by others is part of the common good. So the things we share and the things that differentiate us from one another are both of them very important. And again, it's not a black and white question. We have to respect both those aspects.
So on our Facebook Live feed, Chris has given his 2 cents worth, writing, "People need to think and feel, not ignore and give their responsibilities away to others. Once all the peoples assert themselves, you may find that taking things for granted will shock and amaze and scare." Thank you for that comment. Les asks, should we democratise the economy? Well, that's an interesting concept because the economy itself is obviously part of this bigger discussion. Stephen wants to know how we engage young people to become more involved. I guess the franchise being extended to younger people, as you might put forward.
Can I say something about that, though?
Yes,
because
please.
if you lower the franchise to 16, you have to put that into the context of a very vigorous shared civics education strand in our secondary education. So from about the age of 14 onwards, there should be a lot of education about politics, about the government order, and maybe practicing, having elections in the school, having moots and debates. And then when people get to the age of 16, they enter into some of their civic obligations. Because, of course, the point about voting, and you here in Australia quite rightly have compulsory, not compulsory voting, but compulsory turning up at the voting booth,
yes,
which is important.
Which I should have given context, because what you're really worried about are two events in the UK and the US, Trump and Brexit. But in fact, you look to Australia as having some things, that we've got some things right.
You've got that right. You've got compulsory voting right, and you've also got a slightly more representational system of voting for both the lower house and rather differently for the upper house. In the UK and the United States of America, amazingly, we've got first past the post. And it's very easy to explain to people how absurd that is. Think of a constituency of 100 people. 10 people stand to be elected. 8 of those people get 10 votes each. One gets 9 and one gets 11. And the person who gets 11 goes to Parliament. Now, that is crazy. That means that all the losing votes, and the losing votes will always be in the majority, because most of the MPs in the UK are elected on 35, maximum 40% of the vote in their constituencies usually. That means that the majority of people are disenfranchised because their vote means nothing. So you in Australia have got a couple of things right there, and they are certainly part of what we need to do to get back to the real intention of our representational democracy. Get the money out of it, get the hidden hand of the big data type of manipulation, ask our parliamentarians to be a bit more independent and not just party dependent, and we might get back to the better, even though still imperfect, system that it's designed to be.
Yeah, don't be so certain about the proportional system. I mean, it can be rorted as well. We've had a lot of discussions about our Senate, for instance, and how it goes into gridlock, it locks down, it feels that democracy will, you can't move forward. So there is, not everything is perfect, obviously, when it comes to these systems. But I guess what you're saying is let's garner those votes which would be lost completely otherwise in a first past the post system.
I like that Aussie word, rorted, by the way. We don't have that one in England, but it's a good Aussie word. Yeah.
You may use it. Mihai is curious about the balance between the state and the economy. Again, this question of money. Money should be taken out of the equation, and the human factor should be instead as the sole objective for politics. Corporations can take care of themselves. What's the perfect balance between law and ethics, in your opinion?
Well, look, it costs money to run a campaign, obviously, and to put out information about what your policies are and so on. So you can't get money out of the electoral system anyway, completely. But you certainly can cap it, and you can certainly demand that it should be transparent. One of the big difficulties at the moment in the US, for example, it's unlimited amounts that can be spent on elections, and indeed, if you've got enough money, you can literally buy the White House. In the UK, there is meant to be some control over election spending. The Electoral Commission looks at the level of spending, and there is a cap, but that's only in the period of the election campaign itself. And the trouble is that a lot of the high-tech stuff that goes into campaigning, messaging, targeting voter groups and the like, all that money, and that would be big money, is spent before the Electoral Commission kicks in, and that's distorting. So too much money, big money, money spent in very untransparent ways, that is corrosive of our education system. So I agree we should be very careful about it, but I'm afraid there has to be some.
Indeed. Rabina sends a compliment and a plea. She writes, "It feels so wonderful to hear a wise and learned philosopher contribute so eloquently to our shambolic national discourse. Where are our Australian philosophers speaking out?" Well, there are some speaking out. But,
there are. You've got some very, very good philosophers here. And, of course, everybody knows Peter Singer. He can be controversial in some people's eyes, but I think there is somebody extremely thoughtful and has made wonderful contributions to the public conversation, not just in Australia but around the world. I mean, he's a leading figure around the world, challenging people's consciences over things, for example, like poverty. He does a wonderful job, and he's not alone here.
Of course, there's many critiques of the way he sees the world, but we won't do that here today. This is not the forum. But just let me ask you again about the representative side. And in fact, I was reading, is it Paul van Reybrouck, the Belgian writer, philosopher, who writes that, in fact, our problem with democracy is elections, that people think that democracy just means going to the ballot box and putting your vote. And he says, let's do away with that. Let's go to a system of lot and ballot and groups drawn from the community to come together to discuss issues and then to put those forward. What's wrong with that as an idea? It seems like a pretty
it's a good idea.
Short circuit.
Sure. There's a lot to be said. It's called sortition, or there's lottery. One system is you have a very, very highly trained, highly qualified, really excellent civil service, and they put forward ideas for legislation, for laws, for reforms. But then by lottery, you choose, like a big jury of the people who will sit for a year or 2 years or whatever, and they will vote on these proposals. So that's one form of sortition. In the book that I've just written about this matter, however, I take a much, much more modest and with small c conservative line on how we could make the existing system work by a few adjustments. My motive for saying that is that even though there might be better alternatives and much more dramatic ones, it's extremely unlikely that we're going to get there in a hurry. So if we do the modest thing, then maybe we can make things better now. But he's right on the other point that you mentioned too, which is that democracy is not just about periodic elections. I had the really great privilege and enjoyment of being asked by the United Nations Development Agency to go to a conference in Bhutan shortly after the king, the former king of Bhutan, had, against the will of his people, imposed democracy on them. So they had a conference in Bhutan about what is democracy. And my little contribution was to say, look, the thing about a democracy is it's noisy. It's people debating, criticizing, disagreeing with one another, putting forward suggestions and having them shot down. The sound of tyranny is silence, because nobody's contributing. So it's a good thing that there's a certain amount of turmoil and noise. And the other thing is that democracy is inefficient. And that's good news too, because inefficiency protects our civil liberties. In a country like China, the reason why China is steamed ahead with the absolutely fantastic economic growth is because the government can tell people what to do and allocate resources, and there's no disagreement possible. So it's very, very super efficient. But it's not a country you would want to live in if you were interested in your human rights. Therefore, we should look at the positives. The noisiness and the inefficiency of democracy are positives, providing that behind the noise and the inefficiency, there are not hidden hands pulling the levers against our interests.
Marina sends a triple-barrel question. Let's see how we go. How do we educate a democratic society? What can we do to change politicians? This is interesting because in the equation, there's the electors, the elected, and there's the system, and they're the three things that you say need to be kind of in balance in some ways. Citizens are the voters, but the politicians decide. Most of the time, the politicians lead citizens to revolt by the lack of objective dialogue. We will have the will we have the necessary freedom to do this? And I guess this brings into play those three. I mean, you, I guess, back the elected rather than you back the electors, obviously. That's where the source of power comes from. But you back the elected to do the right thing.
Yes, if we could get them to do the right thing, then I think Winston Churchill saying that this is the least bad of a lot of bad systems would probably turn out to be true. Now, in what you read out there are certain little tensions. If you have a very small society, now Aristotle, for example, said you could have a city-state which mustn't be bigger than the stentor, that's the town crier. It can be too big for people in that state not to hear him when he broadcasts the news. So in a society that small, yes, you can get everybody together and everybody can have their say and everybody can have a vote, and and then it's the electors who are really in charge of the process. Then, however, you fall foul of Plato's criticism that the result might be anarchy. And when there's anarchy, people are very exhausted and troubled by anarchy, so you get the strong man who steps in and the tyrant takes over. Aristotle himself and the much later people who devised this idea of these institutions, so if we confer our authority as voters on people who are meant to go get the facts, do the thinking, and do a good job for us, and if they don't do that job, we can chuck them out, that idea helps us to have both the final control over the process, but also the freedom to get on with our lives. You know, we've all got jobs and kids and want to go fishing and swimming. And we want to get on with our lives. We don't have to want to keep watching our politicians every second of every day. So let us make sure that the institutions that our politicians populate will constrain them and will deliver what we want, which is good, sound, stable government.
Now, in relation to dead votes, Michael has just written in to say, democracy seems to work in theory, but in reality, what I believe and what I actually vote for doesn't actually seem to make a difference. How do we get representatives in government that actually represent the people? Now, someone's going to lose, aren't they? I mean, there's going to be a dead vote somewhere.
Oh, that's true enough. So what one does have to look very carefully at the way that a vote can count. So systems of representative voting, which really reflect preferences among the voters, is extremely desirable, providing we can guard against what you describe as the outcome in your Senate. That would be one thing. The other thing is that after the franchise began to be extended from the early part of the 19th century, parties had to exert more and more and more control over their members in Parliament in order to get their agenda through. Party discipline is very, very anti-democratic because, as I said earlier, they're not our representatives anymore. They're just there. They're just lobby fodder, voting fodder for the party interest in Parliament. So we've got to free up our representatives. My view is that if you're elected on a manifesto, you should be obliged to vote for your party line on that manifesto. That's what got you in there in the first place. But on every other matter, it should be a conscience, a free conscience vote. And that party should not be able to dragoon their MPs into the lobby to vote for things which are not on the manifesto. Like, for example, this same-sex marriage thing.
When it comes to democratic overshoot, or what it might appear to be, like let's take the Donald Trump ascendancy as an example. Many people say, how did this happen? How do we get someone so unqualified to be doing this? Wouldn't another answer be, well, look, this is how kind of democracy works, that sometimes it overshoots, but then it will come back. And over time, there is a levelling out. And people's expressions are levelled out in that way. I mean, could it not just be that democracy is working? I mean, you take Trump as being an example of it not working.
I pretty emphatically think it is an example of it not working. I mean, it really does look to me as though these deeply undesirable and unsuitable outcomes of the Brexit vote and the Trump election are a signal that things have gone too far, that we've passed the tipping point. And when we look at why that's happened, we've said, here's a very imperfect system, and this system actually has been ripe for some agency, some very, very clever manipulatory agency to come in and really work it in the wrong direction. And I think that what's happened with these big data algorithms and hyper-targeting of hidden, so people didn't know that they were being maneuvered in that direction, that this is an example of things having gone much, much further than merely overstepping. Because you're right, there have been occasions in the past where we've needed to ratchet back a little bit as a result of one particular vote. In the United States of America, they could get rid of Trump maybe by impeaching him before, but get rid of him in a couple of years' time, so it's only 4 years. But Brexit, I mean, if the worst case scenario happened there, this could be a lifetime, a generation, before we got back on track again. So we have to think of much more flexible and adapted ways of working the system so that it will always be more likely than not to deliver a good outcome.
So if you looked at other, because people have talked about more participatory style democracy, different ways of kind of doing it. Representative democracy is the one that you're backing. But what if, we looked at that equation again, elector, elected, and the system. What if we put more on the electors, that, more referenda, more ways of being able to directly participate and give their vote? I mean, we talked about sortition a minute ago, but that's not quite right either, because that's not about, people voting in numbers about things. It's about deliberation. What do you think of different forms of democracy as opposed to the representative version?
Well, I repeat the point that the reason why I come up with this very small c conservative view about what we should do is because I'm trying to be realistic and trying to get it done in a hurry. But as you correctly point out, as we said in the case of sortition, maybe there are other ways that in the ideal, if we could achieve them, would be better. Now, obviously, the ideal way would be to have an electorate which is so well informed, so thoughtful, so perceptive, so altruistic, so long-termist in its thinking, so tolerant and open and inclusive, that every decision they made would be a wonderful decision. And it's precisely, the most extreme kind of elitism that you find in Plato, or even indeed in H.L. Mencken, who famously said, a belief in democracy is an over-optimistic belief in the collective wisdom of individual ignorance. Now, he's really having a go there, isn't he? And you get lofty people who say, well, the people, just shouldn't have a vote at all. We should be running it. Plato said that philosophers ought to run it. Well,
it's a good idea.
That's not too bad an idea. But, it's just not realistic at the moment to expect that. However, look at Switzerland. Now, Switzerland, among the wealthy, advanced countries of the world, has the closest thing to a direct democracy, because they have a lot of referendums. But the interesting thing about Switzerland is that they have a very, very well-educated, actually very thoughtful bunch of electors there, because they've got into the way of it now. It's their system, so it's in their political DNA. And a lot of people do read the legislation and think about it, and they use their votes wisely. The result? Very, very conservative with a big C outcome. They're very, very much on the right there, because people are not keen to innovate, or not keen to change too much, not keen to change how things are with them. So that is the rather predictable outcome of that kind of system. But it is a possible system, and it's closest to the one where, as you mentioned, we've got the ideal electorate. But if you're going to be realistic, the electorate is not always going to be ideal. So you really do need to have those institutions. It was James Madison and Jefferson and the others who wrote the Federalist Papers who thought, you've got the electorate, you need to have a government. How are you going to make these two really work together? So let's do it if we until we've got to the point where everybody has got a PhD in politics. Until we get to that point, we've got to make sure that we can take the authority of the people and turn it into good government by institutional means.
Just to that point about first past the post, proportional and preference voting, Craig says, in a two-party system, like here in Australia, does a vote really matter? We always have either had a Labor or Liberal Party of some in government. So in fact, Craig's vote, he feels that his vote is lost as well. Just coming back to this thing that it's very hard to make people feel like their vote is counted, whether it's first past the post or whether it's preferential.
I mean, in a two-party system like this one, if you're on the losing side of the argument, then it really does feel as though your vote doesn't count for anything. However, if you had a proportional system which didn't have the very undesirable effect, as you see in Italy and in Israel, where very small parties can really control everybody because their votes really count, and they can be the tail that wags the dog. So you've got to have a carefully thought out system where what you encourage is more than two parties, but not hundreds of parties, and where coalition is as typical as single party government. Because even though there are lots of deficits of coalition, and coalitions also tend to be slow moving and very unreforming because you can't get enough consensus. Nevertheless, I would rather live under a coalition. I would rather live under the German system of coalitions than under the British system of first past the post two-party government.
An interesting note from Paul. AC Grayling, that is a chilling comment. So the problem with democracy is that people can't be trusted to get it right. We need to rig the system to get the right outcome. Well,
that's the worst possible construction that you could place on the idea that we are in a populous, highly diverse society where lots of people have different and very often competing interests, and where we don't agree about everything, where nevertheless out of all this tumult of diversity and differences of interests, we nevertheless need and have a right to government which is going to deliver. It's going to protect our security. It's going to deliver basic services. It's going to take all the resources that we pool together through the tax system and apply it in ways that we want to consent to. And if we don't consent, then, as I say, we can chuck them out. So it's not a question. I mean, I very much resist the idea that this is a sort of an elitist top-down thing. It is the result of the people saying, how can we govern ourselves? Ultimately, it's about our interest in having a degree of stability and a degree of commonality expressed through how out of this great, debate which is society, we can get something working.
So it is still the best of the bad systems for you? Huh?
Yes, very much so. The best of the bad system is very imperfect, and there might be, as we just agreed, absolutely wonderful utopian systems, but let's be realistic and let's go step by step.
It's always such a pleasure to talk to you. You've got such a clear mind. I love your work. Your latest book is called Democracy and Its Crisis. It's an incredible piece of scholarship just for the history of what democracy has gone through in the past 2,000 years, I guess, since Plato. It's been great to have you. I'll just finish with one comment, an amusing comment from Antonia. The problem is politicians don't listen when you do participate. Let's just do Facebook politics. Facebook fixes everything, doesn't it? Question mark, perhaps.
Yeah, very good.
Okay, and one more plug. You'll be on Late Night Live with Philip Adams on Thursday night here on RN, and that, of course, will be podcast, so you can download it. And I think you've also been with Margaret Throsby on Classic FM.
I have indeed, yes. It was wonderful, yeah.
Anthony Grayling, it's been fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good
Thanks
to see
for
you.
having me on.
Okay.
Thank you.
And thank you for being part of this Facebook Live event. Bye-bye.